Okay, so this is a guide to how to write the risk assessment for the STRAND D part of the data analysis mark scheme. So, you need three things in a good risk assessment, but you need to do these three things multiple times for your experiment. So you need to identify as many hazards as you can, and for each one you obviously need what the hazard is. We're going to talk about what we mean by hazard in a sec. What's the risk that's associated with that hazard, and what are the precautions that you've taken to reduce the risk. And if you do those three things for several hazards for your experiment, you are not going to limit your STRAND D mark with your risk assessment. It's going to be as good as it possibly can be. Okay, so the hazard is the thing or action that is dangerous. And we're going to use the example of crossing the road here because it's a very familiar thing. So one of the things that's dangerous about crossing the road is the fact that there are cars and other vehicles on the road. So that's the thing that is dangerous. Note at this stage we haven't said why they're dangerous at all. So the hazard is just the thing or the action. Right? So doing something in particular can be dangerous in your experiment. Okay. The risk is the bad thing that could happen and probably its effect as well. So we've got our hazard as being the cars or vehicles on the road. The risk then is going to be the cars or vehicles colliding with you, and that can obviously cause serious injury. So the risk is the bad thing that could happen. Okay. And finally the precautions, and you can have more than one precaution for each hazard and risk. So the precautions you take when crossing the road, well, there are several, probably longer than this list, but here's some examples. So where possible, cross at traffic lights or a zebra crossing. That's obviously going to reduce your risk by the fact that drivers are going to be prepared to stop at traffic lights and zebra crossings. Always listen and look both ways before crossing. That's going to reduce your risk, obviously, by reducing the likelihood of you stepping out when there is a car there. Wear high visibility clothing. If you do step out, the car's more likely to see you and be able to stop. Don't step onto the road between parked cars, because then you come out straight into the road and the cars again are likely to see you. So all four of those things are going to reduce the likelihood of a collision between you and a car. So that's reducing your risk. Those are your precautions. So don't feel like there's only necessarily one thing that you can write in the precautions box. There might be several sensible things you can do. Okay. And when you lay this out, the best way to do it is in this sort of table format with hazard, risk, precautions. Okay, so I've put the example we've got into there as our top example, and then you just continue on with the other things from your experiment. So another thing that might be dangerous about crossing the road is the raised curb edge. Right, when you step down, you could trip. Okay, so it's unlikely, but it is a possibility. Right. That will obviously cause direct injury to you, potentially, and also makes more likely for you to be hit by a vehicle if you've tripped and you've fallen into the road. So, wherever possible, avoid the raised curb edge. Cross at one of those little dropped curves that are there. So, when you are writing this for your experiment, you need to come into the control session ready, knowing what you're going to write. So you should have thought about this before you go in. What are the hazards for my experiment? What are the risks associated with them? What did I do to reduce those risks? Okay, the more of these you can write, the better. In some ways, you don't have to go overboard, right? Don't write 20 of the things, but 2 is probably not really enough. You need 3 or 4 at least, I'd say. And it doesn't have to be things that are going to cause major injury to you. And some experiments, there won't be things that will cause major injury to you. Anything that could cause any sort of injury or damage to the equipment or the surroundings counts as a hazard. Okay, you should start off with the ones that are sort of most obvious, I would say, and move on to the ones that perhaps are less of an issue. All right, and you have to make the judgment on that. But if you lay it out in this format and you're clear about what hazard, risk and precautions are, you will not limit the marks you get on the D-strand with your risk assessment. Please bear in mind, of course, that the other part of the D-strand, the big part, is the writing up of your experiment. You should have covered that quite a lot in class. There's not guidance on that because really that's kind of specific to your experiment. Okay, any attempt I would make here to explain to you how to do the write-up for your experiment would need an example experiment, and that might cause more confusion than help. Okay, so you should have discussed a lot in class, things like what your control variables were and how you controlled them, all that sort of thing also needs to go in your write-up and is on the mark scheme. This video is just specifically dealing with the risk assessment, and hopefully you'll be prepared for it if you've watched. Thank you very much.